just even the potential of all of these scriptures, the things they talk about, the things they've seen and experienced, and just to think that we even have a chance, that's really amazing, It's really a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful thing. Because life, life can become pretty gray, especially these days where everything is so planned out and mapped out. Everything is just is it's like we've planned adventure completely out of the picture. There's no adventure to a day anymore. And so with this, I find in these beautiful scriptures that that missing adventure,
Mm-hmm.
the possibility of something larger and something greater,
Mm-hmm.
something infinitely beautiful. So well, let's go ahead and start. It's 5 after. Who knows where everybody has gone? But oops, what happened to my page? Here we go. All right. So what we're doing is Brother Lawrence wrote down some of his spiritual maxims, his own little collection of shlokas, of little condensations of his wisdom that brought him his realization, that brought him his constant companionship with the divine. And I think we covered the first two last week, but we'll look at them real quick here. We're under the section Necessary Practices for Attaining the Spiritual Life. And when he says attaining the spiritual life, he's talking about that presence of God. That's what his practice brought him after, I think he said 15 years, but certainly after 10 years, he started to have some of the experiences of the presence. And by 15 years, he said he was having to come up with ways of disguising his joy, his inner bliss in the company of God. And so these are what he considers to be necessary practices. And the first one, he says, the most holy, the most general, the most necessary practice in spiritual life. You can't get more emphatic than that. It's like each one of those makes you sit up a little straighter, like, oh, what's he going to say? And what is it? He says, is the practice of the presence of God, whereby the soul finds her joy, her contentment in his companionship, talking humbly and lovingly to him always and at all times, without rule or system, but particularly in moments of temptation, of trouble, of spiritual dryness, of revulsion, and especially when we fall into unfaithfulness and sin or ignorance. And so just that idea of God as inner companion, which comes quite naturally. We mentioned it last week because the paradigm that he's talking about here isn't necessarily that you have to keep a running conversation with an imaginary friend in the mind. It's not like that. This kind of relationship, this kind of companionship with the beloved happens at a very subtle level when the mind has quieted down to a particular level and you begin to see the structure of things within. And when you realize that you have become in practice two people, you've become a thinker, someone who places thoughts in the mind, and then you've become the hearer of those thoughts in the mind. So you are watching your own mind both as speaker and listener. So you've broken into two people, and that's the fundamental problem that we have, because one of those is ego and one of those is God. And so really the noise in the mind is your misidentified self. And that which is listening, which the ego takes credit for, is the presence of the beloved, the image of God that was placed there. Uh, who knows when?
Mm-hmm.
But certainly at least when you were born. And so to become aware of the presence of God, to become aware of God as the inner self, that he is in fact the experiencer of your life. He is in fact the experiencer of your thoughts and your problems and your pains and your joys, that God experiences them first because it's actually his life that he's living through your body. And that part of that process, that part of God that's living that life through this body mind, gets entangled with identity, begins to think that the mind is unique to him and the body is unique to this, and that he is both of those, the mind and the body. And so he actually then becomes your ego, as it were. That's the teaching. We don't see it that way. We don't understand it that way, but in effect, that's what it is. And so this companionship with God is that it's that knowing that it's impossible to be separate from God, that it's impossible to well, to ever have God be apart from us, that union is forever and is always present. It's only our distraction, that does not allow us to see it. Uh, it's like there was a woman. I don't remember what she was doing. It's kind of paramount to the story, but she was in San Francisco. There's an overlook that looks at the Golden Gate Bridge, and they have these big, you put a quarter in, and they've got these big telescope things that you can look through. And she had this little girl behind her, but she who was running around in the parking lot in grave danger actually. But the woman was there on this, looking through these telescopes then, and was completely absorbed in looking at the Golden Gate Bridge way over there and not seeing any of the danger, not and consequently her daughter being in trouble. But the point of that is that we're very much like that. Our ego is really God hooked up to a telescope of body mind, of senses, the sense organs, and being fascinated with all the feelings and thoughts and sensations and changingness of this world. And so we get distracted. We get caught up in looking through those, and we don't see God, who's right next to us, who's our constant companion in all things. And so that's why the sages talk in terms of remembering God, of becoming aware of the divine. And all the practices that we do are not to build something, they're to remove our distraction, remove our predilection to go to the mind for our sense of identity, to go to the body for our definition of self. And so this is what he's talking about here, that this most important practice is to become aware of your already present relationship with your beloved, and to begin to pay attention to the inner workings of the mind, the inner workings of that inner space, your inner shrine within, so that you can return to that natural state of communion with pure love. He says the second one here, we should try unceasingly. All right, so that's the point of practice. Practice is trying to do something unceasingly. When we sit and do our meditations in the morning, it's not just to have our meditation in the morning so that we can touch some depth or reach some experience or just purify the mind or something. What we're doing is practicing what the rest of the day should be about, which is a constant return to the resting with God inside, in the peace and quiet inside. So he says here, we should try unceasingly to allow each one of our actions to become a moment of communion with God. So here he's saying the same thing, but tying it to our actions. And this is brilliant, actually, because this draws karma yoga in, the path of action. He has a karma yoga teaching right here. And actually, this is the fundamental karma yoga teaching, that we allow each one of our actions to become a moment of communion with God, not a studied act, but just as it comes from purity and from a simplicity of heart, which means that it comes without a calculation of mind, without a desire for result or a desire for an end game, that it comes spontaneously because of that inner dwelling of perfect love, of perfect wisdom. And so we should allow each one of our actions. And interesting how he says allow. That suggests that our actions would be a moment of communion with God if we weren't forcing another agenda, if we weren't living in an out of balance sort of way with a wrong sense of self, a wrong sense of identity. So this gives us a very nice idea of how to do practice. Practice is allowing yourself to be in the presence of God simply by taking away or removing for a moment all of the habits that take us elsewhere, letting our actions become a communion with God, allowing them to be what they are, that to an enlightened soul, a soul who is a normal human being, if I get away with saying that, that our normal state is enlightenment. Our normal state is a free and established expression of that divine presence within. It's where the love of God flows through us and is in charge of our actions. So it's not our hunger that's in charge of our actions. It's not our bad mood or good mood that's in charge of our actions. It's not our keeping track of whether we like this person or not, or how many good things they've done versus bad things they've done that take charge of our actions. But it's actually the very presence, the very seed of self, that inner reality of God and the communion that we share, that we allow that to shine through us without ego getting in the way and blocking that action of love, that action of compassion, that action of forgiveness, which is natural to us and part and parcel of us. And we can see that because when we act contrary to our nature, when we act contrary to wisdom or contrary to love, it hurts. Right? A very simple, straightforward observation. Have a fight with your friend. You want nothing more. Your inner self wants nothing more than to be reconciled with your friend. But there's that ego self. I'm not going to apologize first. She was the one that, She said, the ego keeps track of those goods and bads, just like the ego is what keeps track of our own good and bad, which is why we need grace to get that grip of ego from around our neck so that we can approach God freely and openly, fearlessly, and in a deep amount of love. So, his second aphorism there, we should try unceasingly to allow each one of our actions to become a moment of communion with God. Not a studied act, which means we're not trying to accomplish something. We're not calculating out an advantage. But just as it comes, just as it exists, this is part of that surrender to the moment, to seeing the perfection of God in every moment, so that God is everywhere present and always perfect. And to actually surrender to God is to surrender to the I am. And what is the I am? It's our moment, this moment. And so take a look around you at this moment, and instead of seeing things you'd rather change, seeing things you wish were different, accept it as it is, as the presence of God, as what has come to you, and be delighted by it. Lean into it. Accept it. If you're if you're sick or not well, embrace not being well. It's a miracle to be able to experience sickness, as much of a miracle as it is to experience health. And when you separate from them, when you understand that it's a body that's sick or a mind that's sick, that it's not the self, it's much easier to understand your freedom from that. It's much easier to understand how bliss is not affected by conditions of body and mind. That your nature is bliss. And when you let go of this delusion that you are inside the dream instead of the dream being inside you, when you break that delusion, then you're free of the fear that the dream contains. You're free of the stress, the anger, the fear and smallness that this dream invests in us. And you come to know your nature and you live fearlessly. His third one, here we go. This is the new one. We must act recollectedly, not with that impetuosity and thoughtlessness that mark an undisciplined mind. And we must work quietly, calmly, and lovingly before God, beseeching him to accept our labors. By such unceasing turning to God, we shall crush the head of Satan and strike his weapons from his hands. Right? Okay, so we'll talk about that in a moment here, the idea of Satan and striking the weapons from his hands, because that's what we want to do. We just in Vedanta don't have anything called a Satan, and he certainly isn't armed to the teeth to destroy us. So what is he talking about there? He's talking about our ignorance and our egoism. Egoism does to us exactly what the Christian Satan does to us. It one convinces us that the ego is real and puts the ego in charge. And the ego in charge means I'm utterly selfish because the me I'm taking care of is a body and mind. So of course I'm going to get that last piece of pizza. Of course I need to be all powerful. Of course I need to be all rich. Of course I need a constant flow of enjoyment and pleasure. So this is the condition of a mind trapped by ego. And because that ego doesn't have any real existence, it's always insecure. We talk about that quite a bit. But what he's talking about here is the difference in acting from ego versus the idea of acting from the natural self. When the self acts, it's an inspiration. It's a response to life. When the ego acts, it's always a reaction. And there's always an intensity to it because there's something that's going to be gained or grabbed or held onto, because that's the method for the ego to maintain its existence. Your belief in its existence is a constant collection of things that verify that I am a body and I'm a mind and I exist. And that's why we're so afraid to let go of our hatred, to let go of our anger, to let go of our jealousies. Because if we let those things go, we feel like somehow we will be diminished. We will be smaller because we're ego identified. And the ego doesn't exist, and it will, in fact, be diminished. It will, in fact, disappear. And instead of fearing that, we embrace it because that's the return to our fearless, immortal self. So he says, we must not act with impetuosity and thoughtlessness, just a blind reaction, just not deep thinking. It's kind of like the mind of Twitter, where we don't have a thought more than 40 characters long. And we don't have a conversation more than, 2 lines long, but we max out at emotion, we max out at response and our, we max out in our volume of our response. Say the meanest thing we can think of, say the thing that we think is going to punch them right where we want to punch them. That's what it is to act from impetuosity with compulsion, the mark of an undisciplined mind, right? Because you don't have a watcher of mind. If you think you're the mind, you think you are the one thinking, and you think it's you doing that. And so you don't understand that you're being led, that you've got a hook in your nose, and you're being led somewhere by the mind and by the emotions, which are not sentient. They don't have any wisdom in and of themselves. They're just habits and patterns, restrictions and limitations. And if that's all we're identified with, then life will seem very small to us. It will seem very constricting. So he says we must act in wisdom, with openness. That recollectedness means with an awareness of what you've learned, with an awareness of what life and experience has taught you, and that you take all of that carefully into consideration to temper the reactionary nature of ego and mind. We must work quietly, calmly, and lovingly. That's how the natural person works. Because if the moment's already perfect, there's no stress in working to making it better. You're just responding to what's in front of you at the moment as worship in the companionship and company of your beloved, of the divine. And so we work quietly, calmly, and lovingly before God. That's that presence, beseeching him now to accept our labors, offering. That's that karma yoga, offering of every action as worship to God. So if you're filling out that DMV form, I don't know why I always use that example, but because it's like one of the most mundane things you can do. You go to the DMV and you're sitting there and you're filling out that form to get your license renewed or whatever it is. And normally you're all caught up in the scene and you've been waiting for so long, and this woman behind the counter is barely paying attention and she's not really wanting you to be successful, and you're just trying to hold it all together, and the kids are screaming behind you. And it's at that time that you have to let go of all of those things. Remember the companionship and the company of the Lord. Sit back, calm down, and sit back in the shrine of the heart where all is silent and all is perfect and the presence of God is palpable. And then you fill out that form the best you can, because you're going to offer it to the Lord when you're finished. And so you carefully offer it off. And where is the Lord? Oh, the Lord is behind the eyes of the DMV clerk on the other side of the counter. So you look at her and you smile, because you recognize the divinity in her, because you're fully aware of it in yourself, right? And this is where I always make that point, that you can't see God in anybody else until you see God in yourself, because you don't know anybody else in the world. The only thing you know in this world is you and your own mind. So what you know and think of you and your own mind is what you're going to assume about everybody else. If you assume this angry, ego-ridden self, you're going to be in competition with the rest of the world. They also are thinking that way and feeling that way, and the world is going to be as it seems to be. But if you know yourself to be this vessel of the divine, if you know your true nature to be this immortal love, this fearless wisdom within, then you will naturally see that in others, because your mind gets projected on everyone. That's why you think you know what somebody else is thinking, but they're not. They may or may not be thinking that, but you think that they are. And so we make assumptions based on what we know of ourselves. And that's why Vedanta says the most important thing is to know who you are, because it may not be exactly what you think. So we must act recollectedly, not with impetuosity and thoughtlessness that mark an undisciplined mind. We must work quietly, calmly, and lovingly before God, beseeching him to accept our labor. By such unceasing turning to God, we will crush the head of Satan. We will crush the head of our ego, and we will strike his weapons. What are the weapons? That selfishness, that moodiness, the conditions of body and the conditions of mind that compel us to act in particular ways. When the mind says, I want that, we go get that. The body says, I need that, you go get that. That's the slavery that Christ talks about. That's the slavery the bondage that every religion talks about. We think that freedom means to be able to do what you want to do. But it's not you who produces desire. It's the body and the mind that produces desire. So you're not free. You're subject to the desires of body and mind. To be free means to be without desire, that you can enjoy the moment without having to do, go, be anything different. That's freedom, a freedom from desire, a freedom from need. And we crush that ego and all of its weapons simply by this constant practice of the divine, the awareness. Awareness is what changes us, because we become aware of the impurities. What are the impurities? The me's and mine's that we've held onto and defined ourselves by. So we let go of those, and we crush that idea. We become free. Number 4, he says, during our work and other activities, during our spiritual reading or study, yes, even in our set devotions and vocal prayers, we ought to stop for a moment, so often as we can, in order to worship God in our hearts, to touch him, as it were, by stealth as he passes. That's that reference. It was a reference to a couple of them. It's a reference to the woman in the crowd that touched the hem of Jesus's garment and was healed because of her faith, her belief, thinking, if I can just touch him, I'll be healed. And so he's saying here that constantly throughout the day, you do these stop and check moments where you just stop for a moment and you just recenter. You visit the shrine real quick. You take a quick bow before the image of the beloved in your heart for a moment. You just come in, do a wink wink nudge nudge moment, and then head back out to the world, and do whatever is necessary to be done. And he says do it all the time, not just in your busy days at work. Do it even in your prayers, because our delusion is so chronic that even in our prayers we'll be praying about something, and suddenly you realize you're not talking to God anymore. Now you're thinking about what you were praying about, and you're all caught up in that whole scenario that you were just begging God, to get out of. And hit the idea of God's presence. Well, I don't know what happened to that. It's out there somewhere. So he's saying all the time, do these little, build them into your day. Right? We talk about this quite a bit. Your practice is up to you to design. And so if you realize that you forget God all the time, start doing things, start creating little rituals in your day that will bring your mind back. I remember the one that I always talk about because it was super effective. Gosh, when I used to work in a cubicle farm in San Francisco back in the 90s, and I was just starting my spiritual practice. I'm still starting my spiritual practice, but back then I was really starting my spiritual practice. And I decided that every hour on the hour, I would say a 2-line prayer to God, any 2 lines, but just a quick, prayer. And my rule was that one knee had to be touching the ground, and I had to pray. So I had to close my eyes and actually say my 2 sentences, whatever they were. They weren't the same ones every hour, but so I started doing that. And I tell you, after the first day, I realized, God, I never think of God. Whereas before, my idea about myself was that I thought of God all the time. But when I realized how often an hour happens in the day, 8 times during that day, when that alarm went off, when it was on the hour, and I had to do my 2-minute, my 2-line prayer, I was amazed. Oh my God, an hour's already passed. And I realized, wow, if I'm that amazed that an hour has passed without knowing, the idea of me thinking of God all the time is completely fake. It's it's a total misunderstanding on my part. I don't even think about God once an hour. I came to realize that. And so, but doing that practice, of every hour, I only did it for a week that week. But here it is, like 25 years later, and I'm talking about it still because it makes a big difference. So think of ways for yourself that you can encourage and do what he's mentioning here. Take that time regularly through your day, through your practice, through as often as you're able to, he says, to do that momentary check. Come in, probably start by taking a few conscious breaths. Breathe out, let go of all of the thinking and the problems that are in the present moment. Kind of set your senses out and feel your body, feel the energy, and then become aware of yourself within the middle of that energy, within the middle of that body. Maybe. I'm not sure where you are. I've tried to do that. Have you tried to figure out where you are in your body? Have you done that? It's an interesting exercise. Yeah, because I haven't yet found myself. But one night, the way that I did it one night was like, this was an interesting thing. I'm totally off topic here, but um, I share this because it's a fun and interesting thing to do. Like touch a part of your body and decide, okay, am I above this or below this? The me. Am I above this or below this? And just touch yourself in different places. And you'll find it's like, if you do it very carefully, you'll find that it's not an answerable question. Because actually, once you realize that you associate yourself with your eyes quite strongly. And so you'll realize that when you touch yourself here, you'll say, oh, I'm below that. And then you ask yourself, well, how do I know that I'm below that? What about that sensation is telling me that I'm underneath it? And when you start asking questions like that, the assumptions start getting broken, and you start realizing that you can't even be sure that you're actually inside of the body. Some of the sages say that the soul is actually just behind the back of the head. that we actually kind of ride the body from outside. I don't know anything about those things, but it's an interesting idea to do these things. I remember laying in bed and feeling my toes, the weight of the sheets on the top of my toes at the end of the bed. And I sat there and I learned for the first time that feelings, sensations, don't come with location data. Location data is interpreted. It's an interpolation. You have to use your eyes to see where the bump of the toe is on the sheet down there, and you have to, and you'll use ears. You'll put all of your senses together to come up with the location data for your toes. But if you're laying in bed and feeling your toes on the sheets, you don't know where they are. You don't know where that feeling's coming from. There's no location data. If you don't cross-reference it with your other senses, you don't know what that information is or where it's from. And that's very important to understand that. You say, why? That sounds completely arbitrary to me. What it helps you understand is that you have created the world, the mind that you live in. You don't live in a world, you live in a mind. And that mind is a reflection of that divine nature within you. And if that world is not beautiful and perfect as it is, it's because it's being refracted before it reflects off of the mind. It's being refracted by ego. And it's not making sense because it's not reflecting true. It's a carnival mirror at that point. All right, let's get back to somewhere in the ballpark here. Number 4. So yes, so that during our work and other activities, spiritual reading, practices, meditations, whatever it is, take that moment to come back. Touch him, as it were, by stealth as he passes, since you know that God is with you in all of your actions, that he is at the very depth and center of your soul. Why not then pause an instant in your external occupations and even in your prayers to worship him interiorly, or to praise him, or to petition him, or to offer him your heart and to thank him, or just to smile and wink at her. Just make a connection with the beloved for a moment, whatever that might look like. What can be more pleasing to God than this quitting many times a day of material things in order to withdraw within ourselves and to worship him? What does it mean to worship? Right? Worship is what happens when you're in the presence of unconditioned divine love. That's all. Worship isn't any particular thing that you do. It's the result of being in the presence, consciously in the presence of God. That's what worship is. The soul naturally worships when it becomes aware of the presence of God. So that's what he's inviting us to do. And he's saying, what is there that can be more pleasant than that? And, in practice, we come to find that that's the truth. In practice, we come to find that just having a place of peace within is really an amazing and beautiful thing to have. And that it is way better than the excitements of happiness or overwhelming joy. Contentment is way better than excitement. Contentment is obviously better than disappointment and all the negatives, but it's also better than any of the big positives. And why is that? Because all the big positives require work to maintain, and they're always going to come to an end. And when they come to an end, their absence will be a form of suffering. All right? We've all experienced that. You go out, have a great time, and then you come home to your room and no one's there and you're all alone with your problems again. And where's the happiness of the party then? It's become the loneliness of your collapsing life, whatever it might be. And so this contentment, this simplicity of being, where you just recognize, no, everything is fine. It's fine. And I've been watching as the observer of this world, of this reflection of divinity, forever. And I'm going to be watching it forever. And contentment is the fruit of that knowledge, that you need nothing, You have everything. That you are surrounded by love, deeply in love, and manifesting that in everything that you do. The only difference now is we do it consciously. We become aware of the love that drives us and inspires us to act. What can be more pleasing to God than quitting many times a day of material things in order to withdraw within ourselves and to worship Him? Furthermore, these moments of recollection, little by little, purge us of things of sense, among which alone self-love can flourish. You know, so it breaks our intoxication of with the senses, right? We become aware of how much effort is involved in pleasing the senses, in going and getting what we want, and going and getting what we think we need. You know, that whole, we should never forget, the Garden of Eden, that it's happening every moment, right? That in that every moment we're going out through our senses like Eve did and looking at these beautiful things and thinking that we need them, that they'll be good for food, that they'll give us wisdom, and finally that they'll make us like God, all of which is already true. We are already created in the image of God. We are already content. We are already fine and healthy. But because we get caught up in the things of the senses by living in mind, living in the world of thought, living in the world of change, we're stuck in this constant effort, which takes up all of our life, right? We go to work for 8 or 10 hours a day for what? To pay for all of our desires. What else are you paying for? You know, you have to pay for those vacations and pay for those children and pay for that husband or that wife, pay for that car, pay for that other car, pay for the third car. And life goes on. And so 8 to 10 hours of your day every day is just you trying to afford your own ignorance. To be ignorance is very expensive. Yes, you can see that. The more ignorant a person is, the more they think they have to be happy. And that means the harder they're working and the more distracted they are from the contentment that lies deep within them. So this is what he's inviting us to. He says, indeed, we can give to God no more convincing evidence of our faithfulness than often to put aside and avoid the creature, that we may rejoice for one moment in the Creator. Yeah, when he says creature and creator, what's the difference? It's the changing and the unchanging, right? The creature is that which lives in the world of change, the created being, the thing that is created, sustained, and destroyed, right? In this world of change, that's where all the suffering is, because we're immortal beings. We don't want things to go away. So we're constantly trying to keep them alive, keep them going. And yet it doesn't seem to work. We smell the same rose 3 times, but it smelled best the first time. What good is a rose after 5 smells? You can't smell it at all anymore. So we got to stop going through our senses to find our contentment, to find our joy. Stop going outside and imagining that something of the senses, which cannot be real because it's only a thought. It cannot give you anything more than a thought. And that thought that it gives you can do nothing but be remembered, because you are a witness, nothing else. You're a witness to all of this. Just like your dream body is in the dream. Somebody dumps water on you in the dream, you don't wake up wet, because the dream cannot touch you. It cannot affect you. It cannot give you anything. And so the nature of this world, the nature of the senses, they cannot touch you. They cannot give anything to you. So stop begging of it. Stop thinking that something's wrong with your life because it's not fulfilling, getting all of the things that you're getting. Stop everything as often as you can in a day and go inward and remind yourself of this inner peace that's yours by nature. Remind yourself that the beloved is preparing for you everything, that all of this effort and work in the world is your own attachment to it. It is God alone that gives and God alone that takes. Know that divine. Be in love with that divine. And the fear and necessity for doing it yourself will diminish. For in these things of the sense, in the senses, among which alone self-love can flourish, right? Because it's only in the world of the changing that you're separate and apart from everything. In this world of the unchanging oneness within, this one without a second, which is the truth of existence, uh, self-love can't exist there because there's one without a second. Who is there to love what? There's no distinction. But in the world of change, the ego exists, and the love of a separate self begins to command the roost. I'm not proposing to you to give up material things entirely. That's impossible. Prudence, the queen of virtues, must be your guide. Nevertheless, I maintain it is a common mistake among religious people to neglect this periodical recollection in which they may worship God inwardly and enjoy for a few moments the peace of his holy presence. The digression has been long, but no longer than I believe the matter to require. Then let us return to our subject. So let us once again come into that idea of the presence. It's amazing how many scriptures are written, and really just this simple little aphorism is all that we really need to take us all the way to the feet of the beloved. Just a constant awareness of awareness, just a constant reminder that Satchitananda is your nature, and that it is the divine presence within you, and that the love that you feel, that you share, that you feel, that you receive, is God, that the wisdom, the intelligence that helps you identify and understand everything that the senses is feeding you is the presence of God. Your wisdom and your knowledge is the presence of God. Your very existence is the presence of God. And to come in close contact, I laugh because I was going to say close contact with that intimacy, which is very unnecessary to say, but for some reason in our condition it is necessary to say. Become aware of the intimacy that you share with divine love, with divine wisdom. Become aware of that by stopping everything else as often as you can get away with it during the day, and let yourself sit for a moment. He says to worship God or to adore God. That will happen of its own accord. You don't have to do that. That comes from inspiration. As soon as you begin to feel that presence, as soon as that becomes real in your life, the worship comes naturally. The gratitude comes naturally. Number 5, all of these acts of worship must be the fruit of faith. We must believe that God is indeed within our heart, and that we must worship, love, and serve him in spirit and in truth, that he knows all that happens or can happen among his creatures, that he is self-existent, while we depend entirely upon him, that his infinite perfections are of such sovereign excellence and authority that we are required to put everything, ourselves, our souls, our bodies, at the disposition of his will, now and forever, that in justice we owe him our thoughts, our words, our deeds. Let us see that we act accordingly. What's he really saying there? What he's saying there is that you don't exist. You never have. God alone is. You breaking off a piece of God and giving it your name and giving it your desires and your needs and your wants, and then moving into the middle of it, that's not real. That's not real. It's just a collection of thoughts, a collection of memories, a collection of aversions and attractions, a collection of whatnots. but all of them just thoughts. There's no reality there. That the reason it is such a bliss and results in enlightenment to be surrendered to the will of God is simply because the will of God is your will, your purified will, your highest ideal is the mind of your beloved. So it's not us giving up what we think, what we want, to something that the big man in the sky wants, like he's going to beat us or punish us or crush us, all of which I've heard at different times in my life, that it's not that. God is your highest self, your best self, and you're surrendering not to some third party boogeyman out there who's bigger and meaner than everyone else, but you're surrendering to your own highest ideal, to your own best thinking, your own best self, the self that you have always wanted to be, the person who can be counted on, the person that knows that they're full of compassion, the person always willing to help. Right? I always tell people, if you want to know what your highest ideal is, write your own obituary, right? Because they'll take the nastiest people in the world, but you read their obituary, he was such a quiet man. Yes, he murdered 45 people, but he kept to himself. You read your obituary, that's the highest ideal that you want. So let these scriptures be your obituary. Surrender to that divine love within, and you'll be the person you've always wanted to be. Find out the truth of these things by going inside and paying attention. Learn to observe the patterns of your mind. And you'll see that the mind is not this creative genius from which you construct your self-identity from. It's a habitual device that acts in patterns that repeat. Go to any therapist. They'll help you find those patterns, those unhealthy ways of thinking that you get caught up in, that you're not aware of, because you're inside them. You believe them to be you. But when you grow and understand that you're not inside them, then you can step outside of them, which is what he's talking about here. Stepping outside the ego self and observing things from the perspective of the divine self. And the divine self sees clearly the patterns of the mind, sees clearly the limitations and restrictions of the body and of thought, and knows intimately the infinite depth and freedom that it's sitting in the middle of. So go there, he's saying. That in justice we owe him our thoughts, our words, and our deeds. Why? Because they are in fact his words, his thoughts, and his deeds. So let him have them. Stop trying to take control and trying to own the responsibility for them. Don't. Just let them be. And you stay in that presence. Number 6. Is this the last? No, this isn't the last one. We must diligently. Okay, that means with some effort and some focus. We must diligently examine our consciences to find out what virtues we are most in need, and which are the most difficult for us to acquire, and to learn our habitual sins and the occasions upon which we generally fall into them. In times of temptation, we should go straight to God with complete trust, remain recollected in his presence, humbly worshiping the divine majesty, tell him our woes and our weaknesses, lovingly beg for the aid of his grace, and we shall find in him the strength that we ourselves lack. This is a fun one. there's a lot of philosophy being pointed at and not talked about in this verse here. Diligently examine your conscience, right? Because you are keeping a record of your rights and wrongs. You know what they are. Well, pay attention to them. Don't do what you know you shouldn't do. And this interesting dichotomy that we have, that we pray for one thing and we do another. That's what he's talking about. When you're praying for one thing and doing another, something is seriously wrong. You know, the truth in the Vedanta, and this is disturbing to bhaktis or devotional people sometimes to think this way, but the only that hears your prayer is yourself. Now, isn't it funny that you would pray to yourself for a certain behavior and then act differently? Does that make any sense? Oh God, help me overcome this temptation. And then you give in to the temptation. What did you think? It really means that your prayer isn't sincere. You're not really asking for it, and you'll put God up there and you'll say, "Oh God, I asked you to help me and you didn't help me. I'm such a victim. Poor me. Why can't I change?" Well, you can't change because your prayers are insincere and you don't realize what you really want, what you're really taking and going after. And you're getting caught in your own false nature, your own lies that you tell yourself, you know. And so this awareness, sitting with the divine, will make you aware of these things. And you can only manage that when you're in grace, when you know that your faults don't belong to you, they belong to the body and mind. That you are the ever free self, the perfect soul within, who's the witness to all these things. You're not the actor. You're not the doer. You're not the character in the dream. You're the character in the bed who contains the dream, right? And so he says, find out what virtues you are most in need of and go for them. Learn of your habitual ignorances. Sin means ignorance. Look at your habitual ignorances. Now, what is ignorance, right? I always like to pronounce it a little different. Ignorance. It's those parts of you that you don't look at because you don't like. Those parts of you that you don't face because you don't want to look at them. And so you allow them to exist kind of in a privatized sort of space without thought. And when you fall subject to them, when you're overcome by them, then you just suffer the pain afterwards, sitting there kicking yourself around the block. Why do I keep doing this? Why am I constantly like this? Yeah. Why? These are the things to ask yourself. Why am I praying to myself for success and yet I am undermining my own success? What's going on? Am I being insincere? Where is that insincerity? What's causing it? Because clearly you want that vice. What do you hope to gain from that vice? And has that vice given you what you hope to gain from it? Has it ever given you anything? This is discernment. And this discernment is what happens when you're in the presence of pure awareness of the divine. So we see these things, we begin to understand them, and that awareness itself, the presence of God, changes us. We are changed because of our awareness of the proximity, the close proximity of the beloved, of the divine. We gain our experience, our inspiration from that. We gain our hope from that. We gain our confidence from that. We gain our self-worth. We judge our worth not from the things that we say, do, would think, and are, but from that divine stamp of God herself that is what we are. That is what makes us valuable. That's what makes us beautiful. Nothing in the body, nothing in the mind. Those things will drop off and rot in time for all of us. What remains is this beautiful, blissful, ever free, fearless source of love. With complete trust, remain collected in his presence, humbly worshiping the divine majesty. Tell him your woes and your weaknesses, lovingly beg for the aid of his grace, and we shall find in him the strength that we ourselves lack, right? Because the biggest weakness that we have is our belief that we exist separate and apart from God. And so we're going to find the strength to repair that mistake and understand that we are one not only with God, but with everything. And that which is good for everything is good for ourselves. And when we place others first, inadvertently, we place ourselves first because we are everyone. So these are his 6 aphorisms necessary for attaining the spiritual life. And we'll hit the other ones next week. There are 3 points to be answered in this question: of the union of the soul with God, of the presence of God, means for attaining the presence of God. Yeah, so we've got quite a few more things to go through here. Are any questions or comments about these things tonight? It was almost a review session.
Oh, they still not. Oh, they feel like new. You can view them every day, and every day they feel like new.
Yes, and actually they are new every time. That's an important point, Bindu. Thanks. That's definitely true. Because there's a Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj says that in that book, I Am That, about Jnana Yoga. You know, that he says, when you sit and read the scripture, never think that you've read it before, because the world has never been as it is in this moment. The arrangement of your mind has never been as it is in this moment. And if you read the scriptures new and fresh for the first time every time, they will teach you something new every time.
Yes.
You know, if you think you've read it before, you think you've known it before, then you'll read that into it as you read it. And you'll miss the same things you've been missing all these years. You know.
Must be just getting old, because there's this very small book called Meditations with Nisargadatta Maharaj.
Mm-hmm.
And they're nirupamas. They're just like a page and a half, maybe 2 pages long. These are meditations. And I finished them, and I really liked them. I started all over again, just like I finished it and then started. And I mean, it's like I never read it before. And so, so you go through it, and I'm thinking, oh, yeah, as soon as I finish, I think I have to start reading it again, because anyhow, that's just me.
Yeah. No, it's perfect. For the enlightened soul, every moment is the first time. For the enlightened soul, he doesn't have the memory that he identifies with that defines the moment for him. He sees every moment as new. That's why Sri Nisargadatta says, he says, the world is created new every moment. Every moment. And you are the one that creates it every moment and sustains it. So it's fascinating.
Yep.
Yeah, that purity. That's purity, to be able to see things for the first time again.
The lenses keep changing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. Then we're just trying to get rid of the lenses. Get rid of them altogether.
Mm-hmm.
All of your attachments. See, that's what memory is. Memory is the lens that prevents us from seeing God. Because memory is all of the temporary things that we've collected that we didn't allow them to pass. We wanted them to be immortal, so we made them a part of ourselves by placing them in our memory. But by doing that, we've distorted our view of God. We can't see him anymore. We see objects, we see difference, we see problems, we see lack and hunger, because we've stored up the memories of pizzas and pleasures and uh, experiences. And so they cause us to see the moment as being lacking in something because we remember something different, or we remember a pleasure that isn't present. And instead of seeing the pleasures that are present, instead of being able to absorb the perfection that is present, we project on it the missing pizza, the missing party, the missing friend, the missing lover, the missing whatever. Right? And that's what creates future for us. Just to go through that whole spiel again, that your future is created by your sense of lack of the present.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the present with this lens of the past, and you say, oh my God, there's no pizza in my present, and I like pizza. I remember eating pizza. I remember it being really good. I remember being really happy. So then you have to create the idea of a future, because you're bound to serve your body by giving it the pizza it reminded you about. So now you have to come up with a plan to run and get your piece of pizza and make it manifest into your moment. So, and round you go. All right.
Okay, Maharaj. Yes, thank you
Yes.
so much. Yeah,
Very good.
good
Have a
night.
good night. Nicole, welcome. Nice to see you.
Nice
All
to
right.
Bye, Nicole. Good night.
Oh,
Mhm.
good night, Namaste.
Be well, everyone.